Wonder how many of you are familiar with Christmas in July. Have any of you heard of that? Okay, well, we're going to do a little teeny bit of that here today. We're going to have some Christmas in July. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take our hymnals and turn to hymn number 277. I am serious. I'm not kidding. Get them out. 277. Hark the herald angels sing. But it's only going to be a teeny bit because in an annoying kind of way, I'm going to stop us at a certain point in this Christmas in July celebration. But let's start singing out the first verse here. Let's see if we can get this. We'll do it a cappella the old-fashioned way. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Cut. We interrupt this Christmas in July celebration to ask you a very important question. Do you know what you just sung? Do you know what that means? God and sinners reconciled. I hope you do, because many times we've sung this song here, Christmas Eve, during Advent, and all that over and over again. We better know what it means, but if you don't, guess what? You're going to find out today as we look to the Word of God. Do you want to finish the verse? Yeah. Good for you. You know, at the 8 o'clock service, they said no, so we shut our hands. Let's finish. Joyful all ye nations rise, join the triumph of the skies, with angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. And Merry Christmas in July to all of you. Now let's get down to it by looking at Colossians chapter 1, verses 21 to 23. God and sinners reconciled. Let's talk about God's reconciliation and our response. We invite you to follow along in your own Bibles. It can be found on page 1168 of the Pew Bibles, or you may want to call it up on an app on your phone or device. Colossians 1, beginning at verse 21, the Apostle Paul addresses the Colossians right after he talked about the person of Jesus and his death on the cross. He says this, "And you," to the Colossians, "you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." So let's talk about it now, God's reconciliation and our response. Let's get the bad news out of the way, and that's what you need to know first of all is this. We all start out in life estranged from Christ and hostile towards him. Now that's what Paul says to the Colossians, and if you're thinking, well, that's only the Colossians. How do you know that that's the case with everybody, including us today? Well, other scriptures seem to indicate it. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." I believe all means all there. And also in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And let me find that for you because I do want to read that. The Apostle Paul said this, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind." So this condition of being estranged from Christ and hostile towards him, everybody comes into this world with that condition. Now, what do we mean by these two words, estranged and hostile. The word estranged, if you will, in the ESV it says alienated. That's the exact word. I have a paraphrase word here, estranged. Alienated, some versions say separated, some say far away. I like estranged because if you look at a Greek New Testament dictionary, the dictionary will say this, that the word means to be shut out from fellowship from someone and intimacy. So, yeah, I think estranged is a pretty good word there. And hostile towards him. There again, if we look at what the experts say that have studied the Bible in the ancient languages, this word, if you will, means hostile, hating and opposing another person. So that's the condition that we come in. Now, to illustrate this, not too far from here in central Pennsylvania, in a small town, a long time ago, so I am told by my family members, and I believe them, there were these two brothers that lived in the same house. And they had such a bitter falling out between the two of them that they literally somehow chopped the house in half. And this guy had his half of the house, this brother over here, and the other one, I don't know if it was stayed at the same place or they moved that one too. They literally cut the house in half and separated it. Now, I can't document this because I went and tried to research it. I can't find it, but family members would say, yes, that's what happened there, and they were serious. And every time as a kid we would drive by in that town and by that house, the one half of it, it looked like half of a house. That's why I believe it. So that's really what you call, or a good example of being estranged and hostile. That's how it works out for all of us when we're born into this world. And this estrangement was followed by everyone doing evil deeds. Now you might be here thinking, well, wait a minute. I came to know Jesus as a young person. Are you telling me at 8 years old I was doing evil deeds? Yeah, you were. Now maybe you weren't robbing banks or doing things to swindle people out of money on the internet or anything like that. In fact, you might be saying, I don't know. You might be saying, I know people who are non-Christians that are 75 years old and they don't do real horrendous, horrible deeds like rob banks or murder people or anything like that. Well, the point is, anything that we do outside the will of God, a just and holy God, it's an evil deed. When you look at the acts of the flesh, the evil deeds that Paul describes in Galatians 5:19, he mentions some like, and I will quote, anger, rivalries, idolatry, jealousy, and you might think, they don't really match up with mass murder. Exactly. That's the point. They are still evil deeds. So the point is, from the get-go, that's who we are. We are estranged from Christ and hostile to him, and it manifests itself by us doing evil. There you go. That's the bad news. Good news. However, we can experience God's reconciliation. So now we'll answer the Christmas in July celebration question. What do we mean by God and sinners reconciled? That's what's answered here in verse 22. What you really need to know is this. It is a total and a complete reconciliation. A real reconciliation where we are at peace with God. And I will show you that. I will prove it to you right now. For example, if you look in the book of Romans chapter 5 and verse 10, there's a note there about reconciliation. It says, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. Reconciled. Now, what's interesting to me about this is the word for reconciled in Romans 5:10 is a little bit different than the one used in Colossians 1:22. How so? It's the same root word, but in the Colossians passage, the word has what we call an intensifying prefix. Some of you are saying, now you're losing me. This sounds ridiculous. It sounds like English class. Well, it sort of is. Let's have an English class for a minute here. Here's an example of an intensifying prefix. There's an archaic word that's not used very much anymore called splendent. That's not the stuff you sprinkle into your coffee or tea, by the way, to sleep. No. This is an old-fashioned word, an old word from years ago that means shining brightly. Now, for some reason, down through the ages, a prefix has been put onto that word, an intensifying prefix. You've probably heard of the word resplendent, right? And that means shining brilliantly, not just brightly, but brilliantly. The prefix intensifies the word. What in the world does that have to do with reconciliation in Romans 5:10 and Colossians 1:22? This is what it has to do with. The word reconciled is a Greek word in Romans 5:10 that's just there, that means reconcile. But in the Colossians passage, there's a prefix added to it, and what it means in Colossians is really reconcile. Big time. Isn't that neat? Isn't that amazing? If you want to think of it a different way, I read an interesting fact from Dr. McKay Caston from Metro Atlanta Seminary, and he makes this point. He says, imagine in history that you have a Sioux Indian chief, and he meets with a colonel from the U.S. cavalry on a mountaintop, and they decide to make peace. Well, there's a tradition on the Native American end. The way that you show that you are making peace is you bury the hatchet. That actually happened. Now, here's the struggle with this tradition. According to Dr. Caston, what often those chiefs of the native people would do is they would bury the hatchet, but they would always let a little piece stick up just in case. That really they struggle with that. I'm here to tell you that the reconciliation that we receive of the Lord is one in which the hatchet is completely buried. No little piece sticking up anywhere. That's how reconciled we are when we are reconciled to God. How are we reconciled through Christ? We are reconciled through the death in his flesh. This is what's referred to in the verse previous to this in Colossians 1:20 that we read last week, where he says to reconcile to himself all things by the blood of his cross. It's the death of Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin, that's Christ, to be sin for us so that in him we might have the righteousness of God. In other words, Jesus dies, and through his death as the Son of God, he receives our sin, we receive his righteousness. Why? So that we can be blameless before him, or blameless in his sight, verse 22 says. So he reconciled us so that specifically, look at the three words there in verse 22, that he can present you before him holy, blameless, and above reproach. Holy means set apart, different than the world. Blameless means ethically doing good things without blemish. And above reproach means not able to be charged with a crime. That's pretty amazing, to be separated, to be ethically doing well, and to not be able to be charged with a crime. But some of you might say, time out. I don't buy that. Aren't there other places in the Bible like 1 John 1:8, it says, if we claim to be without sin, the truth is not, or we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So how can we say that by being reconciled to God that we are holy, blameless, and above reproach? Well, notice he says before him, holy, blameless, and above reproach, above or before him. That's the key there, before him or in his sight. Meaning that literally, yes, we always have some kind of a problem. I mean, we're not morally perfect at any point, but in God's sight, we are holy and we are blameless. And we do have the, forgot the words now. Let me read them again. Sorry, guys, this is what happens when you get in a hurry. How about that? In verse 21, holy and blameless and above reproach. There you go. So you might say, well, how does that work? We're not really blameless, but what we are in his sight, that's how he sees us, because we receive the righteousness of Christ. Think of it this way. Your 7-year-old son or grandson or great-grandson, let's say he comes here, this little guy, and we let him come up on the stage where Jim Leonard was this morning, and we say, okay, buddy, you get to do the ministry and music and sing a solo for us. And the kid gets up here, and he squeaks, and he sounds way off key and offbeat, and it is the most annoying thing that most of you have ever heard in your life. You say, get that kid out of here, he's horrible. But you, Mom or Dad, Grandma or Grandpa, you think he's doing just fine, because that's your little loved one. That's your little buddy. That's your son. And you see past all of the annoying off-key notes and squeaks and squeals and whatever he's doing up here, because you see him from that perspective. See, that's how God sees us when we are reconciled. Isn't that amazing? Now, this wasn't written in a vacuum. Remember, we said in Colossians there were a lot of isms, false teachings that were happening at the time. What is the ism that Paul is correcting? Well, as we said last week, it's Gnosticism, which in a nutshell says that God was spirit and altogether good, and matter was evil. So, when the Gnostics heard this gospel, where a just and holy God who is spirit came in the person of flesh, which they said is evil, nope, can't happen that way. How in the world could God become a human being? Impossible. So therefore, the death of Jesus, no, it didn't provide any reconciliation. And Paul here says, oh yes it did, absolutely. Verse 21, you are now reconciled in the body of, and in his body of flesh. That's exactly how it happened, by the death of Christ. And you know, this corrects an ism for us today. You know what ism we struggle with today, I hear a lot of, is an ism, a false teaching that I'm going to call, I'm goodism. I don't know how many times I've had people, they come in, oh, okay, you believe in Jesus, you're a preacher and all that, and you know, we get talking about the gospel, and I might say, well, how do you know if you were to face God today that you would be in fellowship him and with him for all eternity if you died tonight? How do you know that? And many times I hear people say, well, I'm pretty much basically a good person, so I think I've met the bar. That's not the gospel. The gospel is that we, before we're reconciled, are what? What did we say? We are hostile towards God and estranged from him. And it is only by receiving that reconciliation of the death of the Son of God that we can be reconciled. So we really, really have to combat this I'm goodism, just as Paul was combating the Gnostics of ancient times. So knowing all that is how we are reconciled, here is our response. Paul says, continue in the faith. Don't shift away. Notice verse 23. All of this happens if indeed you continue in the faith. We need to be stable and steadfast and not shift from the hope of the gospel. In other words, once you're reconciled and at peace with God, live like it. You know, school's going to be starting in a couple of weeks. Some of the teenagers are going, ugh. And even sooner than that, I guess they're going to be like the double days of football. Anybody going out for football? I talked to a teenager yesterday. He said he's going out for football at his school. I said, good for you. Well, how ridiculous would it be for someone to sign up for the football team at their particular school and not go to practice, not go to double days, not go to the game, not even sit on the bench while the game's going on? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Or same thing if you claim to be a trumpet player, but you never play your trumpet or go sit in with the band and play. That doesn't make sense. And that's what Paul is saying here. If you're reconciled, live like you're reconciled. Continue in the faith. Be stable and steadfast. This hope that you're guaranteed of, including God's Spirit always being with you and guiding you, verse 23. You know, don't shift away from that. Paul was so passionate about this that he says, that's why I became a minister. It's very important, so important to stay on course. Now, why would Paul say that? Why did he write that? Again, I think he's correcting an ism. That's my theory. I can't prove it, but I think so. Remember we said in previous message that the false teachers, the Gnostics and Gnosticism, taught that, well, all you needed to do to get right with God was to have the right knowledge of God. But after you had that knowledge, what happened in the material world wasn't even real. So you could go out and commit the grossest sins and do whatever you wanted as long as you had the right knowledge about God. You were fine. And Paul, I think, is saying, oh no, don't get snookered by that. It's not a matter of get the knowledge and then go do whatever you want. He's saying, no, be reconciled and then continue. Live like one who is reconciled. What ism could this be correcting for us today? Well, here's another George Jensen term. It's not in a theological dictionary. The ism we have to correct today is punched ticketism. What do you mean, punched ticketism? We hear from time to time people who hear the gospel message and they hear salvation is free. Yeah, and they grab that, but it costs you everything, and that never sinks in. And they believe, well, yep, I prayed that prayer, I've been to church once, my ticket is punched, now I'm good to go. Yay! And that's it. That's the end of their faith. Well, that's punch ticketism, and it's a lie, according to verse 23. We need to continue in this faith in which we live. The German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer was murdered by the Third Reich in World War II because he resisted all the schemes of the Nazis. And yeah, he paid a pretty big price for his faith. And he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in that book, he mentioned a term that's probably more theological than punch ticketism. He calls it cheap grace. That's probably a better term. It's the same thing as punch ticketism. What is cheap grace? It's preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. It's communion without confession. It's grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. That's cheap grace, or punched ticketism. And folks, in the church, we have to remove this totally from any part of our mind that there's any truth to that. It is not. It is not a matter of, I punch my ticket, now I don't need to worry about anything, I don't need to follow Jesus, I can do whatever I want in my flesh. That's not the gospel. It is free, oh yes it is, and yet it is a total commitment to Jesus Christ. So now you know God's reconciliation and our response. And I hope the next time, whether it's Christmas in July or actual Christmas or Advent, you hear that phrase, God and sinners reconciled, or someone comes to you and wants to know a little bit more about that from you, that you can look right here no further than Colossians 1, 21 to 23. Yep, we start out in a pretty bad way, but thanks be to God, Jesus Christ provided the way for us to be reconciled, and we then must go forth and live as reconciled people. That's God's reconciliation and our response. Amen. Even though it's late, I'm going to ask our worship leader to come.